The next topic I want to cover is ExxonKnew and oil lobbying. So ExxonKnew is a specific movement that occurred in 2015. And essentially, it was a movement that was started by Greenpeace and Inside Climate News and other, environmental groups that were claiming that Exxon knew about the effects of climate change, the effects of CO2 emissions by petroleum companies, and they chose not to do anything about it and to even exacerbate the problem. Specifically, this came from a 1977 presentation by one of their senior scientists at Exxon, James Blake, where he said, and this is a quote, "In the first place, there is general scientific agreement that the most likely manner in which mankind is influencing the global climate is through carbon dioxide release from the burning of fossil fuels." And then he also said in that same presentation, and this was to the board of directors at ExxonMobil, a doubling of carbon dioxide is estimated to be capable of increasing the average global temperature by from 1 to 3 degrees Celsius, with a 10 degrees Celsius rise predicted at the poles. And that was predicted through 2038. So pretty extreme. Now, this came up as an internal report that was presented to Exxon management, and basically Exxon was actually one of the leaders of doing climate research in the private sector. And they were doing this because they wanted to have a good idea of how to, talk about this whenever, of course, legislation would come in on the restrictions of it. They wanted to be able to show that they've done the legwork and have an option to pivot if they needed to in the future. And so they had a leading, carbon dioxide sampling program, which was implemented in the 1970s around this time, which was decades before they ended up lobbying against climate science. And so this huge issue came about, and it actually caused a court case, which was the state of New York versus ExxonMobil. And what they ended up trying to sue them over was defrauding investors. And so Exxon ended up winning that case and did not end up ended up being found guilty for this. But the argument was essentially that Exxon knew about these negative aspects of climate change and that they should have told investors about this. Now, the issue with this is that, of course, this doesn't necessarily mean that they knew, but it does mean that they had the info. If you've ever worked for a company where they do a good amount of scientific research and white papers, you'll know that there's plenty that get written that never get circulated outside of the company, that may be written by an employee there, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it is the view of the entire company as a whole. And also during that time, but it's also important to consider during that time that the American Petroleum Institute, or API, which includes the world's largest petroleum companies, had a task force to monitor climate research from 1979 to 1983. And on top of James Black's presentation, they had a professor from Stanford who came and briefed that institute, and in February of 1980 in New York. And in his conclusions section, what he said was that he estimated that the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere would double in 2038. This is from 1980, which he said would likely lead to a 2.5 degrees Celsius rise in global average temperatures with a major economic consequence. And he then told the task force that models showed that 5 degrees Celsius rise by 2067 with globally catastrophic effects. So there's a good track record. These are two pretty big examples, but there's a very good track record of showing that the science was out, people knew, and they, didn't act on it. It was the argument from these environmental groups. So after that, so we're going to fast forward a little bit. So that was in the late 1970s, early 1980. So moving forward in the late 1980s and 1990, climate denial from these companies ended up becoming a real issue. and there's a lot of money poured into lobbying. Specifically, the 5 largest oil companies spend about $200 million on lobbying against climate policy annually. And I'll have a link in the description that's going to be, if you have the time and interest to read it, it's from the Union of Concerned Scientists, and it's on climate denial dossiers, is what it's the title of it, and it is a phenomenal read. And in that, they talk about a lot of different examples of this, but as a broad strokes way of discussing this, basically, these companies would fund think tanks. So a think tank, in order to have a better understanding of what that is, a think tank is essentially, in science literature, I'm sure if you took classes where you had to write research papers growing up in high school or college, you had to look for peer-reviewed resources. And so what peer review process is basically where you are, where a scientist writes a paper, and then they present that to others, and it's vetted by these other scientists in order to have an idea of, did they follow proper procedures, and did they, build off of past discoveries without making claims that were not either provable or false or not falsifiable. And so one very common thing, especially since the 1980s, was these think tanks, which essentially is a way where they take a bunch of different scientists and they put them together in an organization, so that some of the scientists in that organization can produce results, and then other scientists within that organization can vet those results. And essentially, this is pretty often used as a way to get around the peer review system, because they are essentially peer reviewing their own work, even though it's a different set of scientists. Oftentimes, they're still paid by the same people. Specific think tanks that have done this and have been heavily funded by these oil companies are the Heritage Foundation and the Center for American Progress. And I'll have links for those in the description as well. As far as other things to watch out for from these, from these oil lobbies, are different propaganda videos. So I'm gonna share my screen with you guys, and let me pull this up. Cool. Pause this, and awesome. It's F2. Perfect. Okay, cool. So now y'all should see my screen. So when we're looking at different propaganda videos, a really good example is PragerU, and I'm sure that's something that a lot of people have at least seen tangentially on YouTube or Facebook or other social media, because it's very pervasive, and it's an organization that does short 5-minute videos on different topics, and it is funded by fracking tycoons Dan and Ferris Wilks. And here are some titles of their videos of some of their videos on fossil fuels are Why You Should Love Fossil Fuels, the Greenest Energy, and Can You Go a Day Without Fossil Fuels? And it's quite a wild ride. And I'm going to share a little bit of that with you.
Here on Earth Day, we're supposed to reflect on all the ways we've made the planet worse. But what if we try something different? What if we reflect on all the ways we've made the planet better? Try this thought experiment. Imagine that we transported someone from 300 years ago, at the very start of the Industrial Revolution, to today's world. What would he think about our environment? Without question, his reaction would be one of disbelief. Not that we had destroyed his pristine natural world, but that such a clean, healthy environment was possible. The air is so clean, our time traveler might say. Where I come from, we're breathing in smoke all day from the fire.
Right. And so as I discussed earlier, but we can, I'll show you real quick. But as I discussed earlier, this is just one little small part of this video, but I'm not going to show you the whole thing. But essentially, this is pretty silly. I mean, when we're looking as an example at the carbon dioxide levels, like I was talking about, we can see, here we go. Perfect. Where is it on here? One sec. Perfect. Okay, cool. So on here, we can see that there's been a precipitous rise in global temperature. However, what he's addressing is, of course, the cleanness of the air. So the part that I would look at would be here where we have, again, temperatures going up. And then, one sec. And here's what I was looking for. Perfect. Okay, so on here we can see this is the CO2 parts per million that I was talking about, where after 1950 was the first time that it went above 300, and now it's well above 400. When we look at that throughout history, where is this graph? Here we go. Perfect. That's the chart I was looking for. Sorry about that. I should have been more prepared. But as we can see here, you have 800,000 years ago, and we have now. Now, when he's arguing this, he's saying this as far as he's talking about the 1700s or 1600s. So he's talking about like back here. Yeah, the air was not cleaner. It's measurably untrue. And so we need to be very careful about propagandas like this. And now I'm going to switch back. And we need to be very careful about propaganda like this because we have to understand who is funding and what is their economic incentive, especially as average people that don't have the time to go through and weed through scientific data and try and understand, how they got to a specific finding. It's much better to say, what is their incentive? Do they have an incentive to lie to me? And start from there and look at it from a critical perspective. And then even more recently, let me check something real quick. Perfect. Yeah. And so then even more recently, and I know Vince has been in the chat today, and I know he's a pretty big fan of Joe Rogan, and I like Joe Rogan from time to time too. But recently, this was a pretty big deal, was not just from the oil tycoons and fracking tycoons having the incentive to lie about stuff, but Joe Rogan oftentimes he's a great interviewer and he does a really good job of letting the other person, talk, but he doesn't do much pushback, which is understandable. When you talk to such a wide group of people, you're going to have a hard time being able to understand enough subjects to critically push back on, claims that are made. But the other day he made a claim, and I'm going to play that on the screen once. Perfect. Okay, cool. So the other day he made a claim, and essentially he claimed that the forest fires in Oregon were caused by Antifa or left-wing activists, and I'll play that short clip.
Enjoy going there. I actually love Portland. It's one of my favorite places to perform. Most of the people there are very nice, but there's a madness going on there. You want to talk about madness of crowds? That exemplifies that right now, and it's to me. They've arrested people for lighting forest fires up there. They've arrested left-wing people for...
Okay, and the rest of it is just him talking about the Oregon governor and the Portland mayor, so not really as relevant to the conversation that we're having. But basically, it was a big deal because a lot of people pointed out that, this is not true, and of course, Joe Rogan has a massive platform, probably the biggest platform of any online personality. And he even acknowledged it. He was very good about it. He even acknowledged it later the next day. And I'll play that real quick just to be in all fairness.
Hello, everybody. I need to make an apology and a retraction. I said something on the podcast with Douglas Murray about people getting arrested for lighting fires. And I got duped. It's wrong. There was one guy who got arrested for lighting fires somewhere else. And someone sent me something about people getting arrested for lighting fires in Portland. And I said it without looking into it. It's very irresponsible. I didn't check. I made a mistake. I fucked up. And
Cool. And yeah, it's a good thing I'm not monetized yet. But uh, basically, that's good on Joe. And we're going to switch back. Good on Joe for acknowledging it, because it really does matter. We need to try and hold ourselves accountable when it comes to spreading of information. But I think it's really important to understand that when we're watching online personalities, myself included, we should always be vetting those people. As what is their bias? Because everyone has inherent biases, and what do they have an incentive to lie to me about this, and so on. It's also really important, I think, to consider and to keep in mind that on that same podcast, when he said this, maybe a little bit of the issue was the fact that he had Douglas Murray on. And Douglas Murray, if you're not familiar, which I'm sure most, at least Americans, definitely aren't, he's a British author. His most notable book that he wrote was The Strange Death of Europe, Immigration, Identity, and Islam. And I think that gives kind of a decent idea that he's got a little bit of a leaning here. But essentially, his main claim to fame outside of being an author is his involvement in multiple, again, think tanks. He's the associate director of the Henry Jackson Society, which is a right-leaning think tank in England, and he was also the founder for the Center of Social Cohesion, which was also a think tank, but ended up having some issues with Islamophobia perceptions, and it ended up not being around anymore because of that. And I'll have a paper on that as well linked in the description. But the point is, when you're going to have people that you platform like this, you have to make sure that you hold their feet. Like, you have to make sure that you're going to hold them accountable. Because obviously he has no incentive to try and not stoke those fires, pun intended. And so, yeah, you need to just know who's lining the pockets of the people that are making claims, and always vet those claims, independent of your, confirmation bias or your respect for those people. And really good from the Union of Concerned Scientists, on that same link that I mentioned earlier, they have a climate accountability scorecard. And so what their suggestion for this is that first of all, they have scorecards for the major petroleum and fossil fuel producing companies. And they have a 5-point plan that they say we should hold companies accountable with. And number one is to hold them accountable to reject disinformation on climate. To 2, support sensible climate policies. 3, fully disclose financial and physical risks of climate change. 4, align their business with carbon-constrained world. And 5, pay their share of the costs. And so I think this is something really important for us as individuals to remember when it comes to, policies being brought up and different economic regulations on these companies in the future. If you enjoyed this clip, be sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out the full live version of the Wealth for 99 podcast, where we talk finance, economics, and public policy from a working class perspective. We'll see you there.